All right, well, good morning. We are happy that all of you can join us this morning. Excuse me. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items that we would like to review. This webinar will be recorded, and we will be sending out a link of the recording in the PowerPoint shortly after. All the participants are muted, but to avoid any unwanted noise, we do ask you to mute your own phones or your computers. Please feel free to type all the questions and or comments in the chat box. And we just want to let you know that this web conference was developed as a result, as a resource, and is definitely not the only tool to use when having conversations about trauma and detention. We continue to encourage you to use each other as a resource and to also try to dig in a little bit more into your facilities and understand their procedures and protocol when it comes to trauma and detention. We also want to disclose that we are not licensed therapists and that the information that we're presenting today, it's from the advocacy perspective. But we do hope you enjoyed today's webinar and that you take a lot from it as well. So welcome to today's webinar, Trauma Responses in Detention. This web conference was developed after several participants of the California Advancing PREA project requested more in-depth training on complex responses to trauma and the unique challenges when it is experienced in detention settings. So it can look a little bit different. So even though many of the points in this web conference can be applied to all forms of detention, the Advancing PREA project keeps many of its protocols and procedures and conversations more specific to CDCR facilities. So please keep this in mind as we present trauma responses in detention. My name is Juliana Baez. I'm Training and Technical Assistance Specialist for the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I would like to welcome Chris Mady and Matthew Van Winkle. They're both Senior Program Officers at Just Detention International, or JDI, whom I will be co-presenting with today. I will also like to welcome today's guest speaker, Vanessa Sapien. Vanessa is JDI's Mental Health Program Director, and as a member of the JDI's domestic program teams, she provides training and technical assistance for correction staff, advocates, and service providers on how to keep prisoners safe from sexual violence. A mental health professional and trained domestic violence and rape crisis counselor, Vanessa has many years of experience helping survivors. She's received numerous awards for her clinical work, including a Presidential Service Award. Vanessa has also been recognized for her work in honoring diversity and social justice and mental health. So welcome, Vanessa. Before we get started with today's important conversations, we would like to share a bit more about our agencies. The California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CALCASA, is committed to ending sexual violence through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, education, research, advocacy, and public policy. CALCASA provides leadership visions and resources to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. At CALCASA, we truly envision a world free of sexual violence.
Thank you, Juliana. And Just Detention International, or JDI for short, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. It's JDI's belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. And no matter what crime someone has committed, rape is never part of the penalty. And this webinar today is presented as part of the California Advancing PREA project, which is funded by the California Office of Emergency Services. PREA, as you all know, is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And this project has allowed CALCASA and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California rape crisis centers in building strong relationships with CDCR staff, and creating sustainable agreements and protocols for the provision of victim services to survivors incarcerated in CDCR facilities. We provide technical training and assistance wherever it's needed across the state. and we are continuing to work. We realize that although we've seen a lot of progress over the course of the project, there's still a gap between the reality and what survivors are entitled to under the PREA law. So we have we would love it if you would take this opportunity to just introduce yourselves in the chat box. Let us know your organization and your current role. And welcome. I see Sure Helplines here. I think I saw, welcome. Good morning, Sasha. Hi, Mona. Hi, Sophia. Angie and Jenny, good morning. I thought I saw Daniel. Oh, there's Daniel and Marcy. Great. Well, thank you all for joining, and we want to make sure that you, oh, Jennifer, welcome. Thank you all for joining, and please never hesitate to ask a question if we're going too fast or if there's something you want drawn out. Just use this chat box for that. And if we can't stop during the webinar, we will save the question for the end and address it at the end. Excuse me. So today's agenda, as you can see on your screen, we'll begin by talking about common trauma responses in a detention. We'll then move on to a discussion with Vanessa Sapien about self-harm and suicidal and homicidal ideation before we wrap up with a section on following up with clients at the facility. And as always, we encourage you to please practice self-care during this webinar, which deals with a very sensitive topic that can be triggering for some. Juliana had sent over with the email inviting you to the webinar some coloring pages. Feel free to make use of those during the webinar. Take deep breaths, step out as needed, enjoy your beverage, just anything that will help you be aware and take care of yourself over this next hour or so. So it's commonly understood that people experience trauma in many different ways. And we know that after a traumatic event, there's a wide range of triggers and ways of coping with a traumatic event such as sexual assault. And for survivors of sexual assault in detention, the lack of control they have over their day-to-day lives can exacerbate trauma reactions and make coping with trauma even more difficult. Whereas survivors in the community can choose to take a moment alone or take a walk outside, that is just not going to be an option for someone who is locked up in a detention facility. So certain facts of life in detention can really kind of exacerbate common trauma responses. There's just a general lack of control over a survivor's environment that's experienced when being held in custody. This can include, obviously, routine pat or strip searches of a person's body, the use of physical restraints, as well as surprise cell searches. And unfortunately, when it comes to searches, not all staff perform pat searches in the same way. We've learned that inmates being searched by officers who have received more recent training often find those searches more triggering because while they're not inappropriate or unprofessional necessarily, they are more thorough and can feel more invasive than the survivor is used to. And cells can be searched. Inmates can be told to roll up in preparation for a move to a different location. This can happen without any warning, which feeds into that sense of not being in control of your own life or safety. During such moves, we know that sometimes paper resources that have been previously received from rape crisis centers or even an agency like JDI, resources that someone has been using to help themselves cope, they could be lost during that sudden disruption or thrown out. And we finally know that PREA makes it clear that survivors and abusers are supposed to be separated following a report and kept apart. But unfortunately, this rule is not always followed, and survivors are sometimes forced to be in continued contact with their abuser. This may sound a little bit like some of the dynamics of intimate partner violence that we observe in the community. So I'd like to just open the floor here and see if you can type in what you think trauma responses might look like in detention. It can very closely parallel what we see in the community. You can see, yep, aggressive behavior, certainly. Feelings of guilt and self-blame are also pretty common. Yes, yep. Cutting oneself off, yep, not participating in activities, isolation or avoidance. Overwhelming sadness, yeah, depression that can, of course, lead to, the wish to self-harm or suicidality. Self-medication, nightmares, anxiety. Yeah, these are all great examples. Sleep disturbances, the inability to kind of even have that rest at the end of a day. So yeah, these are great. This is a great start to the list, and we see that these responses are very much the same that we might observe in a survivor in the community outside. But experiencing these very same reactions to trauma will have very different consequences for a person who is incarcerated. And we created some scenarios here that we'll go over. In the leftmost column, we've listed the trauma response. In the middle column, we kind of came up with what we saw as a likely scenario that might call attention to that trauma response. And then in the rightmost column, we see how the facility would interpret that trauma response as being in conflict with facility order or rules. So the first trauma response might be a difficulty following rules, giving up that kind of decision making. And the scenario we invented was that an inmate might refuse an order to enter a cell with another inmate who has previously threatened and or harassed them. Staff might very well perceive that refusal as evidence of defiance. The second trauma response might be a difficulty controlling impulses. And our scenario is that an incarcerated survivor in dorm housing is quickly ostracized by the others housed there for providing loud and unwanted commentary when the TV is on and about what others are doing in the pod. The comments are often slightly sarcastic or mocking. This can be perceived as someone who is out of control by staff. The third trauma response we listed here comes down to self-medication with drugs and alcohol. And the scenario we give is that after repeated warnings, an incarcerated survivor continues to make prison wine in their cell. They are often visibly inebriated. This can be interpreted by staff as someone who is just an addict, lost cause, hopeless, irresponsible. We have a few more here. The first on this slide might be a challenge around eye contact and maintaining eye contact. And our scenario is that an incarcerated survivor is a witness to a fight between other inmates in the yard. But when interviewed by staff about what they saw, they nervously avert their eyes when providing answers. This can make them be seen as either rude or perhaps untrustworthy or a liar by staff. Second down, if someone is distrustful of authority, our scenario is that A CEO, a CO promises to follow up with an incarcerated survivor on the status of their report within 90 days, but never comes back around. The survivor is then overheard telling another inmate that, quote, staff here don't care about us. That can be perceived as someone who's disrespectful. And lastly, the trauma response of engaging in self-harm. Which of course Vanessa will go into more deeply later. Our scenario is that an incarcerated survivor who frequently cuts themselves is found with a makeshift blade during a search. This can mark them as being attention-seeking, potentially dangerous to other inmates. So we can see that some of these very common trauma responses are going to inevitably bring the survivor into conflict with facility rules and make life even harder for them, compounding their trauma. Now, we always like to keep the voice of survivors central to our work here, and here is a quotation from a member of JDI's Survivor Council, Jan Lastosi. Jan is a powerful speaker on the issue of prisoner rape and how the very nature of incarceration can make trauma much worse for survivors. As Jan puts it, any rape survivor deals with the effects of being violated, humiliated, and afraid. A survivor of prisoner rape has all of these, plus the added emotions of being a prisoner, which range from fear of being locked up to the humiliation and constant triggers of daily life in a facility. Does anyone have any reactions to Jan's statement? Thank you very much. Juliana?
Thank you, Matthew. And again, just a reminder to, as we continue the conversations about trauma and detention, and we're going to share a lot of scenarios and just examples like Matthew shared. If anything comes to mind, share it with us. If you have any questions, share those with us as well. We'll try to respond and have conversations about that as well. So we're working with survivors, right, who experience sexual trauma. When working with survivors who experience sexual trauma, we can expect to work with folks who are deeply struggling and may even self-harm or experience suicidal or homicidal ideation. Most likely in settings such as detention, where trauma can be triggered on a daily basis, just like Matthew shared, this is more of a daily reality for them. The Bureau of Justice statistics does share that although illnesses remain to be the most common cause of death, suicide represents about 7% of all inmates, dead as well. CDCR has in place a suicide prevention and response protocol, which we invite you to get a little bit more familiar with. And we will mention bits and pieces of it through our discussion as well. But before we get deep into conversations, I would like to share CDCR's definition of suicide. One of the things that we've learned is that in order to really understand CDCR, or the detention that we're working with, we should understand what they define as certain things. So CDCR defines suicide as an intentional self-injurious behavior that causes or leads to one's own death. So as we're having these conversations and we mentioned CDCR, keep that in mind as well. We are going to share with you on our follow-up email, Chapter 10 of CDCR's Mental Health Service Delivery System, which is definitely a great resource that is going to share a lot more information on their procedures when certain situations like this happen. We also understand that these situations can be scary to work with, especially in detention settings. And this is why we feel it's really important to have strong policies and procedures within your own agency to help you guide your advocacy if situations like the ones that we're going to talk about or the ones that Matthew mentioned before do arise. A good place to start is knowing what your agency's current policy and procedures are. These can be used as models and can be modified for folks in detention. So what you have can already be applied to a lot of the work in detention. Don't reinvent the wheel. You will need to know who to contact at your at your CDCR facilities. You want to know, excuse me, I got ahead of myself, but you do want to know who to contact at your CDCR facilities in case you have to break confidentiality, or if you have to call someone. You don't want to be scrambling and finding numbers for people when emergencies happens. We do recommend that you thoroughly document all crisis situations, more certainly when, again, confidentiality has to be broken. It's important to have an understanding of what to document, so that follow-up services, which Chris will talk a little bit more about in a little bit, how are they going to be applied and how are you going to be implementing those. We also recommend that you identify as an agency what, again, your internal procedure is going to be with these follow-up services, especially if the follow-up services come from suicidal or self-harm ideation. And before we even get more into the conversation about best practices, self-harm or self-injury means hurting yourself on purpose. So to cope in such a difficult environment, many survivors in detention will use self-harm, just very similar to in the community. Some common methods are cutting or burning themselves, or pulling out hair or picking wounds to prevent healing. In some cases, they can cause extreme injuries that can result in even broken bones. This sounds, again, very similar to in the community, but what we do want to draw attention is that CDCR has specific responses that they follow if there is a threat of self-harm. CDCR will most likely perform immediate extractions or involuntary removal of an inmate from their confined areas, such as their cells or their holding cells or the shower, or even in a small exercise jar that they might be. Extractions typically happen when imminent threat of self-harm has been identified. In CDCR facilities, inmates who verbalize self-harm behavior are also typically referred to mental health. Some inmates may also be referred to the mental health crisis bed program, which provides services for conditions that require an inpatient setting to make better mental health symptoms in a less restrictive environment. These programs are typically located in institutions with facilities licensed as correctional treatment center, which some of you actually provide services to. One thing to keep in mind is that the inmate patients, as they're also known, are provided at a minimum with a safety mattress, safety blanket, and a safety smock. And clinicians who observe these inmates can order that one or more of these items be removed if deemed a threat. And the reason why we want to share this is because we're talking about trauma. So as we're informing you of the appropriate services or follow-up services, keeping in mind all these things is important to really empowering your survivor, especially in these moments of trauma. Working with a survivor who self-harm can be difficult, but again, you can use many of the same skills you've used with survivors and outside in the community. And Vanessa will actually tell us more about some of the skills that we can use with survivors, and some of the skills that she's actually used at CIW, and even provide us some case examples. So again, as Vanessa is sharing these examples with us, if you have any questions or any thoughts, share them with us. The more that we can have a dialogue about it, the more that we can help each other really understand and provide appropriate services to survivors in detention. Vanessa?
Thank you, Juliana and Matthew, for this amazing information thus far. I've really enjoyed and appreciating the encouraging responses from those who are on the webinar today. So a lot of the feedback that I'm going to be providing and sort of the tips and perspective that I'll be bringing to this webinar comes from having worked 10 years within the Rape Crisis Center movement, both as a clinician and as an advocate as well, and then also offering one-on-one counseling services inside of detention facilities. As Juliana mentioned, I do offer direct services at a California women's prison several times a week. as well as groups, and also am one of the supervisors of a support line where we actually offer counseling or crisis counseling over the phone via a support line for incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual trauma. So that is where my expertise lies and what I'll be discussing with you all this morning. Very excited to be here. And when I think about self-harm, this is something that unfortunately I see pretty frequently with inmates who are incarcerated, particularly those who are survivors of sexual abuse. And one of the examples that comes to mind that I had experienced most recently is a woman who I worked very closely with in a group capacity. So she was receiving services through JDI, and I was actually on my way over to the trailer where I offer one-on-one counseling. And I noticed her out of the corner of my eye, and having worked in facilities for as long as I have, I just sort of noticed a different energy in her. She didn't seem like her normal, jolly, happy self. And so I approached her, inquired about how she was doing, and then I immediately noticed that there was blood on the arms of her sweatshirt, that she had been bleeding through her sweatshirt. And so, of course, that was incredibly alarming, and I took that very seriously and asked her questions about what had happened, wanted to make sure that there were, that there was nobody else involved, that it wasn't a result of an argument or a fight, and that there wasn't someone else who was hurt. And she then disclosed to me that she had just finished self-harming in her room due to conditions of confinement that sort of exacerbated her depressive symptoms with being a survivor of sexual abuse. And so at that point, what I did was I made sure that I took her to a safe location within the facility. So I took her to the mental health trailer, and on our way there, as I was trying to keep her calm and sort of talk her through her feelings and what sort of led to her feeling the need to do that, I immediately went into asking her who she felt safe disclosing to within the facility. And I wasn't talking about inmates, I was actually talking about staff members. So was there a sergeant, or was there a corrections officer or a mental health professional who she had a pre-existing relationship with that she would feel comfortable disclosing this to? Because at that point I knew that this was something that I needed to report. And so she gave me a list of names of people that she felt comfortable disclosing her self-harm to. And the reason why I did that was because one of the things that we need to take into consideration, either doing in-person services or speaking to survivors either via letter or over the phone, is making sure that we help them identify who their safe people are, because there's just a lot of mistrust inside of detention facilities. There is a lot of hesitation, a lot of concern around whether or not certain staff members are going to be supportive or make the situation worse, depending on their reaction or their response, that it may not be trauma informed in the way that you and I would respond to a survivor. And so luckily, when I took her to the mental health trailer, there were several staff members present that was on the list that she gave me of people that she identified as being safe. And so we went ahead and reported it to one of those individuals. And so as Matthew and Juliana have been mentioning, that then elicited a full-on procedure that CDR had set up to respond to this type of event. And so the officer that we reported the incident to then reported it to who he knew to report it to, and within minutes there was about 10 people in that trailer who were CDCR staff that were required to respond to this survivor who had self-harmed. And so, as you can imagine, that was incredibly overwhelming for the survivor. So she was an identified survivor of sexual abuse. Maybe she hadn't disclosed her sexual abuse to staff members, but I certainly knew that she was a survivor, and she was just going through a really rough emotional time, had just finished self-harming, and now there are 10 people standing over her trying to respond to these actions. And she was incredibly overwhelmed. She was crying. She was nervous. And thankfully, I was there in person, and I was able to advocate for her emotional safety, not just her physical safety. And I was able to sort of talk her through why this was happening, why there were so many people in the room, that they were all there to support her, that they were all there to do their best to try to help her in this moment and keep her safe. And so then what ended up happening was they took her to a higher level of care within the facility. As again, Matthew and Juliana were mentioning, it turned into more of a crisis bed situation where this woman was then taken to crisis bed, and she was going to be admitted for further evaluation to make sure that she wasn't further harm to herself, or that there was no suicidal ideation and things of that nature. And thankfully, I was able to be with her throughout that entire process. So I was there from the moment I saw her to then following her to crisis bed. And similar to those of us that are doing advocacy out in the community in non-detention settings, it was, a 3-hour ordeal of having to be with her and support her through that entire intake process. And so when she was taken to this higher level of care, there was then a social worker, a CDCR social worker, who came in to do the intake for her. And it was, sort of very procedural. There was a total lack of emotion in part of the process. The social worker, who was very well intentioned, was just coming in to do her job, asked questions that were on her sheet in front of her on the computer, but there wasn't really concern for what led to the self-harm. There wasn't really a lot of consideration taken into conditions of confinement that may have been contributing to her emotional state. And so again, I was just incredibly grateful that I was able to be there while she was being questioned. And then she was transferred and transported to her final cell resting place for the night, where she remained there for 3 days, and then was released. And I was able to do follow-up with her for the 3 days that she was there. They did allow her access to a telephone if she needed it. So again, for the purposes of those of you that are listening on the line, I strongly believed that she would have had access to a phone to call an advocate at her local rape crisis center. And I was able to tell her that that was an option available to her. So that was incredibly encouraging. And I tell you all this just to sort of paint a picture and provide a visual of what happens when these instances occur in a detention facility. Because I think for those of us that are not doing direct service work inside of the facility specifically, it can be really hard to imagine and sort of visualize what that looks like. And so I'm hoping that that's helpful to you all to just kind of gain a greater understanding of what this looks like when we're offering to support to survivors, either via phone or letter or in person if we're lucky, to kind of help us better understand how best to respond and offer support to these incarcerated survivors with these various crises that they go through. Because as Matthew and Juliana mentioned so thoroughly and beautifully, the various triggers in detention and what that looks like, and also that there's just such a lack of control in environments like this. And I think that's one of the key things for all of us to remember, is just the lack of control that incarcerated survivors have over their environment, and that the procedures, as well intentioned as they are, set forth by CDCR and the various facilities that we're doing work inside of or with survivors in these facilities, that they are invasive procedures. So, I think those of us who are advocates understand that having, 10 CDCR employees sort of towering over a survivor, how troubling and re-traumatizing that can be. But again, these well-intentioned staff members were just following procedure as they understood it. I think another important thing to keep in mind is that these procedures can vary depending on the custody level. And so what I mean by that is that from the point that I took her to the mental health trailer where I work on a weekly basis to the time she was transported to her higher level of care, now we're talking about multiple procedures that were taking place. So there may have been one set of procedures and standards for the mental health trailer and a completely different set of standards and procedures for the higher level of care unit that she was eventually transported to later on that day. And so you have multiple people following different procedures, and that can be really, really confusing. And so I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we sort of visualize what this looks like. And that CDCR employees, their job and their function in responding to these types of incidences is all about containment, wanting to contain the situation. That's a word that I hear often when I'm inside of facilities is wanting to contain the situation, and understanding that us as advocates, how vital our role is in being able to provide support, because it's support versus containment. And that, again, that is such a huge positive contributing factor in terms of helping to alleviate some of those trauma responses that Juliana and Matthew covered so beautifully.
Thank you, Vanessa, for that. Again, as you're hearing all this amazing information from Vanessa, if you have any thoughts, if it triggers any comments, feel free to type them into the chat box. And just thank you, Daniel, for reminding us all to make sure that as you're putting everything in your chat box, that it's showing that it goes to all panelists and attendees. Sometimes we tend to put it in a private chat, and then not everyone is going to be able to benefit from it, but we do encourage you to do that. Let's move on and talk about another crisis situation that might come up if a client who is expressing maybe some suicidal ideation and even perhaps has a plan for suicide. As with any situation, we want to make sure to follow, again, our agency's protocol first and foremost. While we know that many survivors of sexual violence experience thoughts of suicide after an assault, we always want to make sure that we are providing appropriate emotional support, excuse me, and balancing when confidentiality needs to be broken to protect our clients. This can be slightly trickier than in the community, because when suicidal ideation comes to the attention of CDCR, just like we've shared and just like Vanessa shared, there are certain steps that need to be taken into matter of policy and procedure. These can involve stripping the person in crisis of their clothing or placing them in protective restraints, but it's based on keeping the body of a person safe, but as we've seen and we've heard, it inflicts more trauma on the mind and on the spirit. For this reason, it's always crucial to, while always taking threats of homicidal and suicidal ideation seriously, to report on a case-by-case basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa so she can talk more deeply about survivors in detention who have expressed suicidal thoughts.
Thank you, Juliana. So, of course, as all of us know, as advocates, suicidal ideation is something that absolutely needs to be taken seriously each and every single time that it comes up. But I also want to really highlight how important it is to have a really concrete and deep understanding of how oppressive the environment is that we're talking about when we speak of incarcerated survivors in a detention facility. And the reason why I bring this up and want to sort of pull focus to this specifically is because we want to try to get an understanding of the context behind the ideation. Working inside of detention facilities and also being a crisis counselor on a support line for incarcerated survivors out of state, this helps to give us a place to help ground the survivor and help reframe the situation in possible ways that you or we may be able to provide advocacy. So, for example, one of the things that I hear often from survivors who are incarcerated are things like, I can't take this anymore. I don't think that I can handle this environment any longer. Sometimes this place just feels unbearable. And while all of those statements are and feel incredibly striking, especially when you're reading a letter or hearing a person's voice over the phone or seeing them in person, we really also want to take into consideration that those statements are also have a lot more to do with conditions of confinement than potential suicidal ideation. And so, as much as those statements are striking, we want to make sure that we're digging just a little bit deeper and wanting to really understand what is behind those statements that could potentially mean suicidal ideation, but again, could also be talking about conditions of confinement. So we want to make sure to flesh out that the person has a plan as well as means before making a report. And so again, while suicidal ideation absolutely without a doubt needs to be taken seriously each and every single time, I think us as advocates wanting to take into consideration the social circumstances of being in confinement, we really want to make sure that we nail down whether or not that survivor has a plan and has a means before making a report, and that we're able to speak on that with as much detail as possible before deciding to make that report. And the reason why I say this is because oftentimes when we feel compelled to make a report, what we don't realize is that that report could then lead to a lot of negative repercussions for that inmate if we misunderstood or didn't take the time to really sift through what these comments mean. As well-intentioned as we are, we want to make sure that we don't jump the gun, for lack of a better word. And so oftentimes what'll happen is that if we make a report about either suicidal ideation or self-harm, or whatever it is, past self-harm, is that then that inmate could be put in solitary confinement. They could be stripped of their privileges. They could receive sort of like a violation, which could be called a 115, depending on your facility that you're working with. They could, sort of receive a slip stating that they, committed some sort of action that is frowned upon. And so again, these are not really trauma-informed responses, but these are things that do happen quite frequently when things of this nature are reported. And so we want to make sure that we kind of talk this through with the inmate themselves, with the survivor themselves, and really gain a deep understanding of what it is that they're really talking about. I certainly have had situations where the survivor that I'm working with or speaking to does speak of suicidal ideation, and I am then immediately sort of jumping into safety planning if and when I've determined that the survivor isn't an immediate threat to themselves, and want to make sure that we come away either from that conversation or in a detailed letter or in person, coming away with a really strong safety plan for that individual. And when we talk about safety planning, one of the things that I really want to stress to you all as advocates and really sort of challenge you to start thinking in these terms is that those of us who have experience as advocates out in the free world in non-detention facilities or settings, we have a lot of tools in our toolkit around self-care and coping skills and things that we're quick to sort of offer survivors of sexual abuse. But what we want to take into consideration when working with incarcerated survivors is a lot of those tools that we've come to rely on as advocates don't work in a detention facility. So some examples could include things like a therapeutic walk. Other examples of that could include listening to music or watching television. These are things that, while well-intentioned and great suggestions for survivors that are not incarcerated, may not work for those in a detention setting. So when we think about safety planning and talking through how to keep survivors safe, we really want to make sure that this is a collaborative process rather than a prescriptive one, because we want to make sure that whatever plan we're walking away with to keep the survivor safe, that it's something that is attainable and achievable by the survivor. So really wanting to work with them and have a deeper understanding of their environment and making sure that our offerings are really practical and things that the survivor actually has access to. So that could include things like positive self-talk, that it could include things like relaxation exercises, that could include things like drawing or writing. Those are things that certainly most inmates would have access to. But again, those are just sort of some key things that I think have come up quite often. And again, just wanting to stress and highlight that it's incredibly difficult when we're talking about working with incarcerated survivors. I know that my colleagues would agree that those of us who are working and staffing the support line here at JDI and those of us who are responding to letters, that this is incredibly difficult and challenging work, and having to read or listen or come in contact with folks who are expressing conditions of confinement and talking about how difficult it is to be incarcerated and be a survivor of sexual abuse. That is such a huge challenge, and this is no small feat for those of us who are advocates doing this work. And so I just want to again commend all of us for the work that we're doing, and really stress how powerful it is for these survivors to just have somebody who is a compassionate witness to what they're experiencing and what they're going through. And the fact that we are just there offering support in whatever way we can really, really does go a long way for incarcerated survivors.
Yes, thank you for that, Vanessa. Again, thank you for all of the chat that's going on and all the information that everyone is sharing. We can't emphasize enough how important it is for, all of the work that you do, and for you to really, be a current participant in the conversations, because that's how we learn, right? That's how we've learned a lot of the skills that we have. We've learned them from you. We've learned them from the work that you're doing. And just like Vanessa shared, we already have these tools and these skills, and it's just applying them in a different format, right? Just changing them a little bit. So please, again, feel free to chat any questions, any comments in the chat box, and we'll try to respond to them as we go. We also want to take some time to talk about homicidal ideation and spend a little bit of time with that as well. And we know that while as advocates, we always have our client's safety on our mind. And it's also, and because of that, it's also important to look out for, signs of homicidal ideation. After a traumatic experience, some survivors may express wanting to kill their perpetrator. Others struggles with other interpersonal relationships. And in those struggles, they may be significant conflicts. If CDCR received information that there is a threat against someone, again, they're going to likely going to perform immediate extractions or involuntary removal of an inmate. They might provide mental health referrals, or there might even be cases that, take other punitive measurements, right? It's all depending on the situation. We also encourage you to become familiar with your facility's major in such cases. So ask them these questions, just like Sasha brought up, right? In these meetings that you're having with your PREA compliance manager, ask these questions, right? It's one of the things that we've learned as part of the project is that if we don't ask, we're never gonna know, right? It's better to just ask the question, let them tell you what they see or they perceive their protocol to be, and then work based on that. performing, again, performing, well, actually, I'm going to turn to Vanessa so she can share a little bit more about her experience when it comes to homicidal ideation, or just give us a little bit more of insight of the work that she's done when it comes to that. Vanessa?
Thank you, Juliana. Yeah, homicidal ideation can be incredibly complex when we're talking about a detention setting. The way that I've seen it sort of roll out kind of falls into three different categories. One is certainly homicidal ideation against the perpetrator, as Juliana mentioned. And so again, that could be against another inmate or a staff member themselves. It could be homicidal ideation against another inmate who maybe isn't the perpetrator, but maybe somebody who was involved in the rape or the pre-incident itself. Maybe they were somebody who helped set another inmate up to be raped, or somebody who maybe knew that it was going on and didn't say anything. So there are a number of different reasons other than being the perpetrator themselves for there to be thoughts of homicidal ideation against another inmate or staff member. And then there is the third category, which is homicidal ideation against the survivor themselves. So maybe the survivor actually disclosed the abuse, or folks thought that they were going to disclose the abuse, and so then we're needing to keep them safe because either staff members or other inmates receive word that this person is thinking about saying something and are wanting to retaliate against them. So a lot of different scenarios for retaliation inside of detention facilities that we need to consider and explore when talking about homicidal ideation. And so again, as with suicidal ideation, this is something that we absolutely need to take seriously each and every single time, and is going to look different depending on the circumstances. But one of the ways in which I've seen this play out, where I was sort of directly involved in keeping a survivor safe, was a client of mine inside of the detention facility where I do work most often had disclosed to me that there were a group of inmates who were looking to retaliate against her because she was making a lot of waves within the facility, wanting to expose perpetrators of sexual abuse inside of the facility. And these she had found out that these folks were sort of after her, and she had it on good authority that they were going to hurt her in some way, and they had already sort of spent several weeks sort of taunting her, letting her know that that they had plans to hurt her. And so thankfully she felt safe and had identified me as her safe person to talk to about that. And I, of course, immediately reported that to the facility. And that officer that we reported it to, again, identifying from the survivor herself that the officer that she wanted me to report this to was a safe person for her and someone that she trusted, and did my best to make sure that I was reporting it to that specific officer. Thankfully, they were available, and that officer was aware of her situation, was aware of her circumstances and what had been going on. Again, because they're there much more often than I am, so they had a lot more insight than I did at the time of what had been going on in the day-to-day around this situation. And they then were able to tell the housing officer. So in every single housing unit within a facility, there is a housing officer for each and every shift who is there overseeing the sort of day-to-day goings on of that particular unit. So it was then reported to them, and they then talked to their fellow staff who were also responsible for overseeing the unit about what would be the best course of action to keep that individual safe and make sure that no harm was done to them. And so what it ended up requiring was a bed move from her roommate. To make a long story short, it was the roommate that was sort of the ringleader of this hostility towards this individual. And that was enough to sort of keep this person safe. And thankfully, everything worked out, and she no longer felt like she was at risk or feeling threatened in any kind of way. And so, in this situation, I think what I learned, and what we can all learn from this too, when we're offering support to incarcerated survivors in whatever capacity we're able to, is also wanting to make sure when we're talking about safety planning, either through suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation, or preventing further harm to this individual, is we want to make sure that when we're identifying safe people, that they're not just safe people that are identified by the survivor themselves, but that we also have multiple people who cross multiple shifts. So when we're talking about working in a detention setting, there are essentially 3 shifts, first, second, and third watch in every prison that I know of. And we want to make sure that there is a safe person identified by that survivor in each shift. And the reason why that becomes important is because, like in this situation where homicidal ideation was the concern, and we needed to make sure that this survivor had around the clock protection, that she had a safe person that she could report to at any time, at any point throughout the day. And that there was going to be a safe person that she felt comfortable disclosing to in each and every single shift. Because if there was only one safe person that she identified, then we run the risk of her only feeling safe to report her concerns during a specific window of time when that staff person is on duty. So as much as possible, wanting to sort of think through those specific type of details that we don't necessarily have to think about when we're talking to a survivor in the free world who is not in confinement, whether it's we're talking to them over the phone or via letter. These are sort of specific special considerations that we need to take into consideration.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you again. And again, I can't emphasize enough, if you have any questions or any comments or just any thoughts, please feel free to type them into our chat box. We're going to have Vanessa the rest of the webinar, so she's able to respond to some of those questions or comments as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa and Juliana, for talking to us more with those case examples. That's always really, really helpful to hear from folks who are really doing the work inside facilities. And I think what's really important to remember is that, you know, while we're doing that work in the immediate crisis, we want to make sure we're also providing follow-up. And that includes follow-up with the clients themselves. Also, if we had to break confidentiality and make a report, that we're following up with the facility, and that you're also following up with your internal team, so you're getting the support that you need as well. So when you're following up with a client, this can be part of the safety plan that you can develop with someone if they've expressed to you that they are thinking about self-harming, are thinking about suicide, or hurting somebody else. And again, like Vanessa has mentioned, emotional safety is often the primary way that safety planning can be done with incarcerated survivors. And again, like we've mentioned multiple times, a lot of the tools we suggest to survivors in the community just simply aren't going to work for folks in detention. So again, we can't tell folks that they can take a long bath or go for a walk or even call a friend to get that emotional safety. As in a detention setting, these just aren't going to be available options. So tools and tips you want to make sure are accessible within the setting. And again, you can always look at that list that I know Juliana sent you all in the email reminder on self-care ideas that are applicable in detention settings. Also remember that each facility and unit can look differently. So make sure you're really asking the survivor what's going to work for them, given their current living situation. So things like journaling might be possible, art might even be possible, reading a book, exercising. But again, it's going to really depend on where they are. And again, you can always brainstorm these things with survivors. One of the things that I like to offer out is progressive muscle relaxation as a coping skill, as this is an exercise that, no one really needs to know that they're doing this, so it can be done privately, and they don't need any sort of external things. So progressive muscle relaxation, for folks that aren't familiar with it, is a process that relaxes your mind and body by progressively tensing and relaxing different muscle groups throughout your entire body. And if this is something that you are offering to a client, if they seem like it's a good idea for them, you want to make sure that you walk them through it, either over the phone or in person, so that you're not just saying, go do this. You're really explaining how to do it. You do it with them so that they can take that and make it part of their own self-care practice. I noticed on the chat box that someone asked a question on kind of how to do appropriate safety planning on the phone, given that there's that time constraint. This can be incredibly difficult, and I think especially when we're in those crisis situations, we want to fit everything in, and that can be really hard, again, with that time limit. But that time limit doesn't mean that that person can't call back. So what I often will start the conversation off as is letting them know that the call might be cut off at 15 minutes, but that you really want to make sure that you're giving them the care that they need, and they're welcome to call right back right after that call cuts off. So that's an option, so that you can go through your the normal processes that you would with folks in the community who don't have that cutoff, is just allowing them and encouraging them to give a call as soon as that call ends. So that's an option that you have. But again, with safety planning, it's really important not to make guarantees to folks, especially around what's going to happen with a report. Unfortunately, as Vanessa's talked about, sometimes reporting doesn't always go the way that we want to, and it might not be the most healing of processes. But again, we want to take when someone discloses homicidal ideation or suicidal ideation very, very seriously. So if that person does have a plan and the means to do hurt themselves, we want to make sure that we are, taking care of that and taking care of that person. But being realistic with what that might look like, making sure the survivor understands what they're going to be going through. And again, like Vanessa talked about, making sure that they know who they can talk to at the facility. And so, Vanessa, do you have an example of a safety plan that you've helped to develop with a client?
Yeah, absolutely. So safety planning, again, is just sort of one of those critical processes and procedures that we're all going to sort of find ourselves in. One of the things that I've noticed as sort of a concrete first step when creating a safety plan is really wanting to make sure that we sort of de-escalate the caller if in fact we are offering services over the phone as much as possible. So again, that was one of the things that I was trying to highlight earlier, is just how incredibly difficult and challenging this work can be, because we often are dealing with conditions of confinement coupled with the trauma itself, and that these conditions of confinement can definitely exacerbate some of these trauma responses and symptoms that our incarcerated survivors are facing and experiencing. And so de-escalating could very much include self-care tips, as well as self-care and coping skills in that de-escalation. And so the reason why I mention this and why I think it's important is because as we are sort of exercising these tools over the phone with a survivor, we're also putting them into practice so that the survivor begins to understand what these tips actually look like. And so as Chris was mentioning, we do have sort of this limited time frame, and all of these limitations are sort of set up around us when we're offering support and advocacy in sort of these restrictive situations. And so as much as possible, being able to really paint a picture for that survivor of what that tip looks like. So whether it's over the phone, we want to make sure that we're explaining it in as much detail as possible, or actually sort of giving an example and coaching the survivor on how to use that tip, or if we're providing services via mail, wanting to make sure that we're sending relevant materials that we trust and that we have sort of vetted via our prospective agencies on how to again execute that tip. But safety planning absolutely includes, as I've shared before, making sure that we're identifying safe people for that survivor. So that includes a mix of both inmates and CDCR staff that they feel comfortable going to for support, comfort, guidance, reassurance, so on and so forth, as well as their support system outside of the facility if that is an option for them, if they do have family or friends outside of the institution that they can talk to. We also, again, are wanting to make sure that we include a fair combination of both of self-care and coping skills that survivor can utilize. And, as Chris mentioned, I'm also a big fan of progressive muscle relaxation and deep breathing. And, I just absolutely want to highlight the importance of just taking a breath and how important that is, and making sure that even if maybe over the phone, we can even say, before we move on, can we take a breath? Can we just take a minute to just do some deep breathing and kind of get ourselves centered as much as possible? And that can sound incredibly ridiculous, but it is really the best tool in our toolbox. And then wanting to make sure that as much as possible, we gauge the survivor's understanding of the procedure and their prospective facility. So as Chris was mentioning, when we're on the phone with survivors via our hotline, I'm always wanting to understand what that survivor's understanding is of the various procedures that are set in place, either for reporting or for what happens after the report is made, really wanting to gauge from them what their understanding of that procedure is, and helping to work within that as we develop our safety plan. And then wanting to make sure that we identify where their designated safe spaces are within the facility itself. So I can think of a lot of facilities that I've seen where they're not just confined to their cell, but they have a day room or places to go outside, or if that's an option to them, do they have safe places within the facility that they can go, or is there a place that is providing them the most confidentiality or the most privacy for them to just sort of take a minute for themselves. So those are things that I've definitely sort of talked through with survivors in various capacities.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I think secondarily, once we make a safety plan with someone, I think a huge part of that needs to be, how are you going to follow up with that person? So it's really important to make sure that you're not kind of letting them go right after you have this crisis call with them, or you are doing in-person services with them. So making sure that they know that they can call your line back, or that maybe you'll be writing them a letter, kind of however you're going to get in contact with them again, make sure that they're aware of that and that they know how to get in contact with you. It's going to be really, really important. So again, while following up with our client is our primary concern, it's also important to follow up with the facility if we had to make a report about the client's threat to themselves or to others. So this way you can ensure that your report was taken. You can also determine what sort of actions that CDCR ended up taking. This might be the time where you realize that further advocacy on behalf of the survivor is needed to keep them safe, or to advocate for that survivor's well-being. So as always, and as we continually talk about, having a strong working relationship with your contacts at the facility is really going to make this process a lot easier. Without that, it's going to be really hard to have a conversation about what they're doing in terms of following their policy or not. And this will help you better advocate on behalf of your incarcerated survivors when you have that good working relationship. So an example of this is when I've had to call in someone who had a plan and means for suicide. Unfortunately, the facility didn't really take that report very seriously, so I had to continually call my contacts at the facility to make sure that my survivor was safe. So unfortunately, it wasn't just a conversation I was able to have with the survivor, but again, there was constant contact with the facility to make sure that that survivor was safe. And finally, after your calls or visits where your client is in such a level of crisis, it's also important to make sure you're taking care of yourself and that you're checking in with the staff at your agency. So these aren't easy calls to take. And sometimes we wish that we could have done more, or maybe we feel like we've said the wrong thing. But know that the fact that the survivor disclosed to you and felt safe enough to share with you the difficulties that they're going through, that's incredibly huge for them. And that by just being there and listening, you're doing something, and often that's more than anyone has ever done for them before. So this isn't easy work, and we want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. And just like we tell our clients to have good self-care, we encourage you to have a self-care plan as well. And as always, use your agency or the pre-advancing team as support. So we're always here to support you. Don't ever hesitate to give us a call to check in and see how, how things are going. And if you need any additional resources, we're always here for that. So though this work can be difficult, and the advocacy that we provide can be really challenging, it's important to remember that the support you do provide is life-changing for survivors. So as a survivor at CIW stated, it is such a joy to know that we don't stand alone, that we not only have the few solid people here within the prison to lean on, but we also have you as an advocate to call on, to talk with, to walk with together. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Vanessa and Matthew, for just the in-depth information and narratives that you've been providing throughout the presentation and the webinar. Again, we encourage you to ask questions. If you want to have more of a one-on-one in-depth conversation with us, we can definitely do that as well. One of the things that we do want to mention is tracking and reporting. This is not only a reminder for our participants to submit their monthly progress reports, but also a reminder of the importance of tracking this information. We know how important it is to be able to say in a tangible way, these are the numbers that we've been receiving. These are the things, the common threats, or the common threats that we've seen in our facilities. All the data that you collect for the progress reports that you submit to the Advancing PREA project, can help you in could benefit you in identifying the needs of specific communities and the needs of additional training for inmates or staff, or even for your own agency. I'm sure that your wheels are turning right now, and after hearing a lot of the conversations, you are all thinking like, okay, so if realistically this was to happen to a survivor that was to reach out my facility, what would I do, right? So keep track, report everything that happens. We understand that sometimes it seems like we're not getting survivors because we're so used to getting having survivors call us, but in detention, sometimes we have to go in there and look for survivors, right? So track everything, report it, send your monthly reports. This is a really good way of us showing to Cal OES the importance of the work that we're doing. We've seen a big change in shifts from year 1 to year 4 of the Advancing PREA work, of how now there is additional funding for work being done in detentions, and there's additional now highlights of the importance of the work that we're doing. So please send in your progress reports. We really do use them, and we really do, benefit from all the information that you send us, and all of the data that you send us. We do like data, I promise. We just want to remind you before we let you go that there is a few upcoming events. On January the 25th, we will be providing a South Regional training in the LA area. The location hasn't been decided just yet, but I know that this is more of a regional training. So if you go to the region trainings for the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, you probably have heard of the training already. We will be providing one in the northern region area. So for those of you in the north area of California. As soon as we get more information, we will definitely let you know of that. Also, reminder that on March 12th, we'll be facilitating our last webinar of year 4, Sustaining Our Services and Sustaining Ourselves. This webinar is going to focus more on the sustainability of your services when it comes to providing victim services to survivors in detention. We always encourage you or welcome you to reach out individually to us if you have any questions, any comments, if you just want to talk about something that's challenging happening in your facility. We also have advocate@justdetention.org or priya@calcasa.org, where the team is actually able to see, depending on the team, is actually able to see the questions in response to any comments that you might have. So this is a really good way of getting in touch with us as well. We always like to finish with providing you some resources. Again, we are just a small bit of the resources that can be provided. So reach out if you have any questions. The CALCASA website houses the online modules, and pretty soon we'll be housing all of the archived webinars for the Advancing PREA project. So the webinars that we've been recording, those will be housed there as well. We also encourage you to visit Just Detention International website. They have an amazing archive of webinars related to work in detention and toolkits and just materials. They also have a lot of information in there. And our to-go resource is the PREA Resource Center. They have, again, an amazing FAQ section that provides a lot of responses to maybe some of the questions that you might have right now. This is also a good resource for corrections. So if your PREA compliance managers happens to have any type of questions, you can always refer them to the PREA Resource Center as well. And we also want to provide you more in-depth resources focused on the work and the conversations that we had today. These are just 2 of the websites that you can visit to find out more about suicide prevention. There's definitely a bigger amount of websites out there, and I'm sure that you yourself have resources of your community who is also providing information on suicide prevention. But these are 2 that we found and that we actually liked very much. So we invite you to visit them and to even share, any information you have with each other. At this time, we really would like to see if there's any questions, any last minute comments. Please feel free to take this. This is your space. This is your time. Please take advantage of it. Again, if you don't have anything right now, but as you present this information with your staff, because we always do encourage that you do this in your monthly meetings to continue the conversations about PREA. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. But is there any questions, any comments right now? We'd like to open the floor. Vanessa's still with us, so if you have any questions on any of the narratives that she said, we're good. Seems like there's not a lot of questions, which is okay. We're definitely going to reach out to some of the comments that we've been seeing. Again, if you have any questions and you continue to learn a little bit more about your facilities and your survivors, and as you continue to have these conversations with your own team, please feel free to reach out to us. I would like to see if any other member of the team would like to say anything. Vanessa, is there anything else you would like to share with us before we let everyone go?
Sounds like Vanessa's going to touch base with Sasha directly about the CIW question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, if we don't have any new questions, thank you all for attending. This has been really wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have an amazing day and Happy New Year. We'll talk to you all soon.